The Greek fleet at Salamis were preparing for another attack until they received news that the Persians were retreating. The Greeks sailed all the way to Andros without sight of the Persian fleet and held a council of war there. Themistocles wanted to follow through on their victory and sail to the Hellespont to break down the bridges. The Arabiades thought this was a bad idea, as Xerxes would then continue to fight tribes and build up his army and lay waste to Greece and all of Europe. Themistocles resolved to not push further in pursuit of the Persians. Themistocles needed money to help rebuild Athens and used his navy to accomplish that task. They laid siege to Andros for refusing to pay a sum of money to the Greeks. Themistocles then sent threatening messages to other islands with similar demands. Many islands sent the money through fear of facing the same fate as Andros. Meanwhile, Mardonius was escorting the king north since winter was approaching, which wasn't suitable for war. After the Persians reached Thessaly, Mardonius chose 70,000 troops, which included the entire body of immortals, except their leader, who refused to leave the king. He chose 1,000 cavalry, and Xerxes left Mardonius in Thessaly and marched towards the Hellespont. Along the way, the Persians devoured whatever food was to be found, including grass and tree bark, and fed themselves as they were hard-pressed by hunger, as well as plague. Many Persians died or fell sick, and when they reached the Hellespont, they found their bridges already destroyed by storms. Time for some more lashes. Luckily, they still had ships and crossed using those. While Xerxes was on a ship, a storm crept up, and the ship swayed heavily because of the amount of Persians on board. Xerxes called out to his helmsman if there was any way to escape the danger, in which the helmsman replied no, unless they lowered the amount of Persians on board. Xerxes then announced that now was the time to show their love for the king, and his safety depends on them. So many Persians leapt into the sea in obedience, and the ship was lightened, and Xerxes made it safely back to Asia Minor. As soon as he reached the shore, he sent for the helmsman and gave him a golden crown because he preserved the life of the king, but beheaded him for causing the death of a number of Persians. Meanwhile, the Greeks couldn't capture Andros and returned to Salamis, and the Athenians returned to Athens to rebuild. Mardonius sent a squad of Persians to lay siege to Plataea after they revolted when Xerxes had passed. They also laid siege to Olynthus as well, and they were able to take that city quickly. They then continued to press the siege at Plataea. One of the captains in the city entered a plot to betray the city. Whenever the Persians needed to send a message to that captain in the city, they attached a note to an arrow and shot it over the wall, and vice versa. However, when the Persians attempted to send a message to the captain, they missed their shot and hit one of the townspeople in the shoulder. A crowd gathered around the wounded man and pulled the arrow out, noticing the paper in the process. They read the paper and found out who the traitor was. The Persians thus failed to take the city through treachery and kept up the siege for 3 months. They then attempted to use an unusually low tide to attack the town from sea, but the tide returned with a very high tsunami, and all who couldn't swim perished, and the rest were slain by the city's inhabitants. Any survivors returned to Mardonius in Thessaly. Before Mardonius used his army to attack Greece, he attempted diplomacy and sent Alexander of Macedon to Athens, since he was connected to the Persians by family ties and connected to Athens by friendship. Mardonius realized that if he could win the Athenians to his side, he would have mastery at sea, and he thought he was already superior by land. He tried this because the oracles counseled him to make Athens his friend. Alexander arrived at Athens and conveyed that if they joined Mardonius, they will be forgiven, and their city would be restored. The Athenians denied this request, of course, and Alexander returned to Mardonius. Mardonius then took his army and made haste to Athens. When Mardonius arrived, Athens was once again empty, and their citizens withdrawn to Salamis. He then sent a messenger to Salamis asking for their surrender once again. Everyone denied surrender, except one, but he was stoned to death along with his family, as they assumed he was bribed by Mardonius. The Spartans responded by sending an army before the Athenians could surrender, and when Mardonius heard of this, he no longer cared to remain in Attica. He did no harm to the land, hoping the Athenians would come to terms with him. He wanted to withdraw from Attica before the army reached the isthmus. When the Athenians failed to come to terms, he resolved to burn whatever was left standing in Athens and retreated towards Thebes, hoping to lure the Greek army into territory suitable for the Persian cavalry. Mardonius created a fortified encampment on the north bank of the Esopus River in Boeotia. The Athenians sent 8,000 hoplites to join the Spartan army. The army then marched to Boeotia across the passes of Mount Scythion, arriving near Plataea and above the Persian position. The Greeks took up a position opposite the Persian lines, but remained on the high ground. Knowing that he had little hope of successfully attacking the Greek position, Mardonius sought to lure the Greeks down into the plain. Mardonius initiated hit-and-run cavalry attacks against the Greek lines in an attempt to lure the Greeks down to the plain in pursuit. Although having initial success, the strategy backfired when a Persian cavalry commander was killed, and with his death, the cavalry retreated. With this small victory, the Greeks moved forward, boosted by high morale, and moved to a new position more suitable for encampment and water gathering, while still remaining the higher ground. In response, Mardonius sent his men up to the Esopus and arrayed them for battle, but neither would attack. The armies camped in their locations for 8 days, during which new Greek troops arrived. Mardonius sought to end the stalemate by sending his cavalry to attack the passes of Mount Scythion, which resulted in the capture of a convoy of provisions meant for the Greeks, a huge win for the Persians. 2 more days passed, in which supply lines of the Greeks continued to be intercepted, and Mardonius launched another cavalry raid on the Greek lines, and succeeded in blocking the Gargathian Spring, the only source of water for the Greek army. The Greeks couldn't use the Esopus River as a source of water due to Persian archers. With the lack of food and water, the Greeks retreated to a position in front of Plataea from which they could guard the passes and have access to fresh water. All of this was done at night to prevent the Persian cavalry from attacking during a retreat. The next morning, the Persian cavalry continued to do its usual hit-and-run practice and noticed that the Greek camp was abandoned, so they continued to push forward. When Mardonius found out, he led the Persians forward and crossed the river. Unfortunately, the Greek retreat was unorganized and the army was separated. The Persian cavalry chased the Spartans and Tegeans, while the Athenians were engaged by the Theban phalanx. The Persian infantry made their way forward and began shooting arrows at the Spartans and Tegeans, while the cavalry withdrew. The Greek soldiers began to fall under the barrage of arrows, and the Tegeans started to run at the Persian lines. The Spartans soon followed and charged the numerically superior Persian lines as well. The fighting was fierce and long, but the Greeks continued to push the Persian lines. The Persians tried to break the Greek spears by grabbing hold of them, but the Greeks responded by switching to their swords. Mardonius was present riding a white horse and surrounded by a bodyguard of 1,000 men. The Spartans closed in on Mardonius and managed to kill him. With Mardonius dead, the Persians began to flee, and the bodyguard was annihilated, thus ending the battle. No more than 3,000 Persians outlived the battle, while the Greeks only lost 159. The Greeks shared the booty upon the field and buried their dead. The Greeks held a council and resolved to make war upon Thebes for assisting the Persians. If Thebes failed to give up 2 of their chief leaders, the Greeks would lay siege to their city until they surrendered. The Thebans refused, and the Greeks began the siege, laying waste to the land around and making assaults upon the walls. This continued for 20 days until the Thebans sent a herald proclaiming they would give up the 2 leaders, which were then slain by the Greeks. The Greeks didn't stop their retaliation there. A simultaneous battle on Persian soil was about to take place as the Greeks attempted to bring the fight to the Persians as Ionia begins to prepare for a second revolt against Persian rule. But we will learn more about that in the next episode. Leave a like if you enjoyed the video, and subscribe if you enjoy this type of content. Thank you all for watching.